Welcome to our June 2023 edition of Newark Today on WBGO 88.3 FM and online at WBGO.org. We are talking to Mayor Rasbaraka in our first half hour here, and we have a lot of territory to cover. We'll be talking about the dollar property launch and affordable housing, rent control vote of the recent vote by the City Council, and a number of other issues here if we have time. And then in our second half hour, we'll be talking to Rutgers University law professor David Trout and a landlord about the recent rent control vote by the City Council. We'll dig a little bit deeper in that. We're taking your questions, your comments, your concern at 973-297-0941. That's 973-297-0941. We want to hear what you have to say. Any questions, any comments for our guests? And our first guest this evening is the Honorable Mayor of Newark, Mr. Rasbaraka. Mr. Mayor, how are you, sir?
I'm great. How you doing?
Glad to be here. Glad you're here with us once again. Let's talk about this dollar property launch. I know you talked about the property sale for a dollar before. How is that going? I understand it's supposed to launch next week.
Yeah, we're having NACA is having a big event at Robert Tree Hotel over a 3-day period to really register people, get them involved, start the process along. We are doing houses that have been foreclosed and other houses that are dilapidated, but we're also contemplating now vacant lots. So what we'll be doing at this point is piloting a program where we're going to take prefab housing and put it on a vacant lot. We're going to do one and see what the cost is for that. The city's going to take care of that, see what the cost is, how long it takes, so on and so on, to see if that also works, because we have a lot of vacant lots in our possession as well.
I used to clean some of those vacant lots.
Is that right?
Back in the 70s, my summer job was to clean out the lots, take out the rocks and debris and stuff like that. It was my first job, and I was making minimum wage, and it was good. I was in high school, so it was fun. So that's a fast way, what you're describing. It's a fast way to put something on the lot, so there's no long delay in getting builders and construction and everything else.
Yeah, and we just want to see what the cost of it would be to put the prefab there, put the water, connect the water system, the electricity, all that. What would it cost to do that? And see if it's worth making those available to residents. And if it turns out to be affordable, then we're going to make those available as well.
Now, do you already have a prefab housing builders in the city, in the area to accomplish that?
I don't think we have them in the city, but close. And NACA is helping us identify prefab, for folks that modulate these houses, so we can begin moving forward on it. That's why we're going to do a sample one first, take a look at it, and figure out how we're going to move forward.
Now, is this something that you originally thought would be part of this program, or is this something that you realize now, like, we need more because the demand is so great, we need more?
Absolutely. Demand is so great, we need more. And the city just doesn't have, we have a lot of vacant properties, but not to the extent that the demand is there. What we do have a lot of is vacant lots. We do have a lot of vacant lots. And if we can get those plus the houses that are available, I think we can get a nice number of people into these homes.
How are you judging the demand? Have you seen something where it says that, look,
they just had a pre-meeting at the city council chambers, maybe yesterday or day before yesterday. It was insane. I mean, it was already packed. I went outside, the line was all the way around to Franklin Street and doubling back around the other way, like a twofold kind of line. It was ridiculous. I spoke to a couple of people out there. He had to actually come out and cut the line off because there was no room in City Hall to continue. Just giving people information about the program and letting them know how to register for the June meeting that's coming up. But it was so many people out there. There was also people from other cities too, by the way.
I was about to ask you that.
You're not eligible for this, so yeah. But there were other people from other cities as well. Yeah.
But what does that tell you about the quest for housing and affordable housing in Newark?
Well, it's first of all, it tells us that the demand is large, not just in the city, but the entire state. I think the country has a problem with affordable housing. Just first of all, the amount of housing that's available, period, is problematic. And then if you factor in the affordability of this housing, that becomes even more problematic. And New Jersey has a problem with it, which is why COA and all these other fights that are going on about developing affordability. And I just think the state tries its best, but the best isn't good enough. We really have to have a deep kind of focus on affordability, on home ownership. And because these rents are increasing so rapidly, people feel like I might as well get a home and have the equity and the wealth.
Right.
If I'm going to pay all of this money for rent, we might as well figure out how to own homes. And we want them to do that because it closes the wealth gap.
And are there a lot of, is there any way possible to meet the demand that you saw the other night?
In Newark alone, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Not in Newark alone. I mean, we just don't have the housing stock available, which is why we're going to the abandoned property. I mean, the big lot way, because if we add that, then we could increase the amount of, property that we actually have for this demand. But right now, we just don't have it, Even if we do 500 houses at a time, I mean, that's just simply not enough.
Right.
You have thousands of people registering for this thing, and then it was hundreds and hundreds of people waiting to get into this meeting. So,
because they were lined up on the street.
Yeah.
Wow. Is there then any thought to having East Orange, Irvington, other surrounding cities,
Sure.
come in, help us, be part of this program?
That's exactly what needs to happen. But I think people want to do that, but they want to wait and see what happens here, which is always the case. I get it. We always the pioneer, so we'll see, yeah.
But when they had this meeting the other night, did you anticipate that so many people would show up?
I would have. I told them that, this is going to be a problem, obviously even more people than I thought came. I knew that the council chambers was just too small. Based on the amount of people that have been inquiring through NACA and inquiring just in our office alone about how to get involved in this.
So does the city have fewer available properties in terms of abandoned houses, not vacant lots, than you may have first thought, or the city first thought when you started this program?
No. We have about as many as we thought we would, and the amount of foreclosures that happen a year, obviously. But we want to get rid of these houses, and we want to put Newarkers in them. So we had to go forward with this program, and hopefully we fill them all with Newark residents and get them and turn them into homeowners. Look, if we do 1,000 people, that's a home run for us. If we put 1,000 people in the homes, to me, that's just a home run.
When we say $1 property, people get the perception that
that they only
got $5. I'm going to get me 5 houses.
No, well, that's why I have to go to the session so they can learn what's going on. You're just paying for the lot or the vacant property. Right. You still have to get it done. And NACA takes you through that process.
Right.
It takes you through. You sit in a kind of workshop for 6 weeks or so. You figure out what it takes to own a home, how to get the loan, what it means to pay mortgage, taxes, all of those kinds of things, and whether your income can afford that at the same time. So you go through this whole process, and NACA qualifies you. They feel like you're ready for this. They put you in the home.
If you're one of the people who was at this meeting the other night and lined up outside in City Hall, give us a call at 973-297-0941 and tell us why you were there, what you're looking for. If you have a question tonight or a comment for the mayor, again, that number is 973-297-0941. Mr. Mayor, homeownership is a big deal. As you mentioned, it closes the wealth gap in this country. How do you get there, though, in a place like Newark? If you've been in this city a long time, you're making barely enough to get by now, and your rent is high, and you're looking at this opportunity. You want to take advantage of this opportunity, but how do you do that if you're already living on the edge?
Well, I mean, that's why we offering you the property at this rate, so you have an opportunity to get into a home. Because the thing that prevents people from home ownership is really the down payment. The closing costs and all the other things that attach to it, the credit report, all these things prevent people from getting homes. So we wiped all of those things out. So there's no credit check. There's no down payment. None of those things apply here. And the land itself is going to cost you $1. The house is going to cost you $1. You have to get it assessed at what it's going to cost you to fix the house up. In fact, NACA is going through the homes prior to that so they can let people know ahead of time what it's going to cost for them to rehabilitate this home in a basic way, in a way that they think they want it, and so forth and so on, and what that would cost, and how that would be measured out monthly for them, and what it would take for them based on their income to be able to afford this plus taxes. So they're taking them through that entire process.
And does that process include, here's how to get financing, or we'll help you get financing and so forth?
Well, we're already working with Bank of America. So Bank of America provides the financing, the mortgage without the down payment. So they provided a mortgage tool that they work along with NACA to do this. So they already have the mortgage. So once you apply, you don't have to do all of that. The only thing you're really looking for is a builder. So you can identify your own builder. But the great thing is that NACA has a list of builders as well. So contractors to help you build or rehabilitate the house.
And Mr. Mayor, by NACA going through and looking at this and estimating and judging what things need to happen and what the costs are, you're saying they're giving potential buyers a realistic picture of what this is about. Don't come in here and think that for $1 you're going to move in next week.
Right, absolutely. They give them, well, you have to go through a course to even qualify. You can't even get the home unless you register and go through the course. So if you don't do any of that, so it weeds a lot of people out in that sense, because you have to go through the course. You have to be ready financially. Obviously, you have to have income and all these other kind of things. But they don't do a credit check or any of those things. They just kind of counsel you through the process and get you in a home. So NACA already exists. They do thousands of other homes. They provide some of the lowest cost of mortgages and money. The interest rates are very low. So they do all of these programs. All we're doing is adding a program to the arsenal of programs that they already have for Newark residents only.
I want to switch gears here a little bit about, we're still talking about housing, of course, and affordability. The unconscionable rent increase ordinance that the council just approved by a 63 vote last week. What is that all about?
Well, it's really an opportunity to slow down the rate of which rents are increasing in the city, and they're increasing at an astronomical rate. I mean, we already had a report where LLCs are buying homes and are charging people astronomical rents. They're raising the rents on individuals way above 100%, which is a recipe for homelessness, for displacement, for gentrification, for all these things. So we have to slow that down. I mean, you get housing developers and builders and people who are kind of parroting or mouthing off what these builders are saying, are like, oh, this is going to stop people from building, which is a ridiculous statement. I don't think so. They said inclusionary zoning would do that. It didn't. I think that we have to, because right now the courts decide what unconscionability is. You can't, if a person goes to court and they are evicted because you raised the rent, the judge can basically at this point says this is unconscionable and you can't raise the rent at this level. The judge has the authority to do that. What we did was throw something in out there to create this discussion and this debate and dialogue, which is happening. So it worked. And we're going to continue to amend this ordinance till we get it to a point where it's court proof.
And is it court proof? It's not court proof right now?
I mean, on its face, people can challenge it right away because the state allows for folks who, at this point, who have new construction to avoid any rent restrictions as a pilot, but they extended it. So they're all going to jump behind that to try to weasel their way out of it. The problem, though, is that, these rents, in our estimation, are incredibly unconscionable because you can't come to people's neighborhoods who are used to paying $900, $1,200, $1,500 for 2 and 3 bedroom apartments and begin to charge them $2,500 the next year or $2,400 the next year. You can't do that. You're going to move everybody out of it. And then we're going to be dealing with homelessness in the city. And the state has to realize that these rents are a problem, not just the new construction, though, because this is not just about new construction. It's also about people who purchase these properties on foreclosure, sheriff sales, and then in turn raise the rent 50, 60, 70%, trying to displace people purposefully and deliberately. And the anti-eviction law explicitly says that that's illegal, that you cannot raise the rent with the intent of displacing or removing people.
I'm curious, if someone raises the rent by the examples you give, are they then still finding, as somebody who can't afford it, they move out? Are they finding tenants who are going to move in for that
Well,
much?
yeah, the market will bear that in some instances because, I mean, if people are used to paying twice that amount or more than that in neighboring towns, then they'll come and pay that amount and think that's in fact affordable to them.
Good. We have a call, Mr. Mayor. This is Cass from Elizabeth calling about the $1 property. Cass, thank you for calling Newark Today. What's your question, your comment, or your concern?
Hey, Raz.
Hello, go ahead.
Mr. Mayor. Yes. So I'm originally from Baltimore, and there was a very successful $1 house program in the 70s when I was growing up. I want to know from the mayor what they're going to do different than they did with the Valentine's Day houses that they sold for $10, which was a complete disaster. What are they going to do different with these dollar houses?
Well, I mean, the Valentine's sale was lots. It had nothing to do with homes. They were giving away lots and they were $100, not 10. But it was $100 lots that were given away. I think the difference is NACA is involved in this from the beginning to the end. So it's not about Newark, it's about NACA, who are coaching people to begin to buy homes. So they at this point, they don't have to build the home. They don't have to build anything from a vacant lot. There are homes that already exist. They have to rehabilitate these homes. They already have a mortgage from Bank of America promised to them if they finish the class that NACA has available to them. And they have builders on hand, so they don't have to search for builders. So builders will be there to build the property for them right away. So this is explicitly different from, the Valentine's Day sale that took place years ago.
She said the Valentine's Day sale was a disaster, was it?
I don't know if it was a disaster, but the issue was that a lot of people bought property. But they didn't have the wherewithal to continue to build the housing on that property or build or develop on that property. People wanted to buy land for $100, so they did it. They didn't have the proper counseling. They didn't have a developer. They didn't have an organization like NACA. So this is about home ownership. It's not about purchasing land. It's about home ownership. And if you get a vacant lot in a city, the prefab home will be brought to that lot. So you're not necessarily buying a vacant lot. You'll be buying a prefab home on the vacant lot already.
It sounds like the new program is incorporating lessons learned from the $100 lot.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to the Kat. Thank you very much for calling. I want to go back to the rent control issue. Now, what the council voted for is that you can't raise the rents above 5% per year for the units that are not in rent control.
Right. So any unit that is not under, because right now under rent control, there are stipulations. It has to be based on cost of living increases if you raise the rent. Obviously, if there are other issues with the apartment, you probably can't raise the rent either. You have to go to the rent control board and you have to register your property. So right. We are asking all properties to register their tenants and buildings, how many units they have, how much they're charging people, so we can get an idea of what the cost is and what's happening around the city in terms of rent, period.
There are people who may look at this from the outside looking in it, even in the city, and say that what's happening in Newark is awfully heavy-handed, government heavy-handed into the capitalistic private sector, and just it's government stepping in and doing this. How do you respond to that?
Well, I mean, they're not altogether wrong. It's we're regulating, and I think it's necessary because, unchecked, capitalism at this point kind of trammels on the rights and opportunities of, working people in this country who are having a difficult time, especially in high inflation, in times when the costs are rising, when rents are rising and their salaries are not rising at the same rate. The government has to step in and stabilize the economy because we'll be paying more for homelessness. We'll be paying more for transitional homes, for displacement, for crime and healthcare and all these other issues that is a result of people not having proper housing. So we have to step in to make sure that there is not whole-scale homelessness, that there are not large levels of people being displaced, that people are stabilized in their communities. That way, our cost for everything else begins to be stabilized and go down.
Are there going to be fines for landlords that raise it above
5%?
Because that's really what it says. It does not say you can't raise the rent, actually. It actually says if you raise the rent, if you make that choice, then you have to pay the city. You have to pay a fine for that to kind of de-incentivize your desire to raise it at astronomical rates. And the real irony of it is when developers turn in their pro formas, none of the pro formas say that they were going to raise the rent above 5% over periods of years. So what that says is that they have the ability to sustain themselves with rents that are below 5%. So if they're raising it above 5%, then they're increasing their levels of profit. That's really what it's about, increasing their profit versus sustaining the development that they put in place there.
And when does this start in Newark?
Well, it hasn't started yet. Obviously, when the council votes on something, we have like a 20, 30-day period for it to actually be executed. So we're waiting for that period. And I think between now and then, there'll be a couple of amendments. So we're waiting for those as well.
Are you anticipating a legal challenge at all?
Oh, absolutely. We knew from the very beginning. So we said, we're going to challenge it. Well, we anticipated that, right? So we are going to add more things to strengthen ourselves before we get to court. And if that's the case, I think it needs to be argued statewide what unconscionability really means. I think the state legislature needs to step in here and define unconscionability and not leave it into the hands of the courts. And they should really talk about this idea of not allowing new construction to be under the kind of parameters of rent regulation.
Do you think they will step in? Is there any push as far as you know? Are you asking for any legislation from them?
Not at this moment, but I think as this argument kind of grows and that more people engage themselves in it and it gets into the courts and everything else, I think people are going to be forced to land on one side of the argument or the other.
All right, Mr. Mayor, I want to move on to the Help Center on Sussex Avenue. There were a lot of code violations found there. And what's being done about that?
Well, we've already moved most of the residents out of 224. We've put them in other shelters and in the Hotel Riviera. But our objective is not to close the shelter on 224. Our objective is to get them to bring it up to code, to make sure that it is livable and the conditions are well, and make sure we put in another provider in there that we know has a record of taking care of our community better, to be able to make sure that thing runs properly. There's so many things that have happened in there. There were rodents in there,
right.
All kinds of issues that code enforcement found. There were crimes committed in there, deaths in there. This is one of the reasons why it's difficult for our outreach team to go out and grab people off the street and say, we're going to take you to the shelter. I don't want to go to that place.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's being corrected now. You're getting a new contractor?
Right. So we've already, I think most of the people are out of there, that we've already moved them to other shelters now. And we're going to engage the owners of the shelter to get them to redevelop, remodel, get it up to code so we can bring people back.
I want to move on to the climate crisis here and the unhealthy air that we had from the Canada wildfires over this region, turning everything orange last week. But there are forecasts to be more days like that because of the climate crisis. And there may even be one or two of these days again next week, as I understand it. Well, I'm curious, what is Newark doing to shrink its footprint, to limit its pollution, so that it doesn't contribute in this way to the climate crisis?
Well, I mean, one of the things we have to do is plant more trees, and we've been doing that. I mean, obviously, we're getting more money so we can plant more trees as a city. Right now, we're dependent on a lot of our partners and engaging them to plant trees for us, and we've been doing that. So we obviously have to plant more, and that helps us clean the air. Areas that have more trees than we have cleaner air. We have to do that. And we have to get some of these cars off the street. We've changed our zoning ordinance to take away some of the parking lots to begin to create a more walkable city. We're getting a lot of backlash from folks who are just used to car culture. I mean, this country has a deep car culture, and we have to do that as slow and steady as we can. And we can't jump into that really quickly because the residents get really, really upset when you say, I don't have no place to park. So not really embracing the idea that we need more walkability in the city.
I know that the bike program is really doing well. You had you reached 1 million rides, I think it was. So
absolutely.
I guess that's a plus in terms of dealing with the climate crisis.
And we are in the top 10 most rides in the country. You know, more people are riding bikes and scooters in Newark than places like Sacramento, California, you know? So,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, so they're using this program. They're using it. People are absolutely using the bikes and the scooters to go to work, to ride up and down. So it's been great for us.
Do you need more bike lanes in the city?
We absolutely need more bike lanes in the city. We need more bike lanes, which means we're going to take away people's parking and other kinds of things. So we'll have more fights around those things. But I mean, we just have to educate people and just convince people to be on the same page, because the particulate matter in the air, the carbon emissions, all these things that create the issue that we have in Newark, the high heat index, comes from that. And we really have to do better at more electric vehicles, less cars on the road, and dealing with these diesel trucks that come out of Port Authority.
How bad did it get for you last week in Newark? I think it was on Wednesday, which probably was the worst day. How bad did it get in Newark?
Really bad. We were all the way up to like unhealthy kind of air conditions. Like we didn't get to the point where it was like hazardous or whatever. We got to unhealthy, and that's difficult. You have kids outside back and forth to school. Little kids playing in the playground have to stay inside. All of those things that people don't think of.
And school's closed for a day or two.
Yeah, the school's closed for a day. They closed for a day. They let out early one day and closed the next day completely.
You're a panelist on Monday for the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice on Juneteenth, talking about reparations. The bill in the state legislature just to form a commission to study this, it's gone nowhere.
Yeah, and it's creating massive controversy. Why, I don't know. Well, I do know. But ultimately, we're just asking to talk about reparations. I mean, it's not saying we're going to have reparations tomorrow, which would scare the bejesus out of many people. But all we're talking about is why reparations is something that we should be talking about or thinking about, and really outlining the history of slavery and oppression in the state of New Jersey, not around the country, but here in New Jersey.
Why is there this resistance? If all you want to do at this stage is just to study it?
Because people who know, right? So I think they realize that there have been some egregious institutional and systemic things that have impeded the growth of Africans Americans in this country, and that we're asking now for somebody to be held accountable for it. I mean, what does that mean to folks financially? What does it mean to the state? What does it mean? What are we going to say that folks have to do? So it's scary to people to have to face their accusers and have to live up to the things that were done to us systemically.
We have a couple of minutes left, and I want to talk about your consideration for the governor's race. Where does that stand now, sir?
I mean, I guess it's the same place we talked about it before, but I think we're getting a little closer, that's for sure. I mean, I have a lot of events Saturday. I'm going to be in Salem County. By the end of September, I would have gone to every county in the state of New Jersey, talking to people, and people who are talking about real issues, not people that are trying to get you or people who are just like, you get these things and people get cynical, or, the same people call in and follow you around so they can talk to you about one thing because it's personal. But around the state, man, I mean, even in Warren County, talking to people about the lack of transportation, about the lack of employment and opportunity and jobs for people, and what do you do for families who are involving themselves in crime and kids who involve themselves in crime because of the lack of those opportunities. Same issues that we have in Newark, they have in farmland and in urban and rural places in New Jersey. So it's opening my eyes to a lot of things across the state. So if all said and done, I've learned a lot from this tour.
All right, Mr. Mayor. And when you get ready to announce your decision, you'll do it here on
WBGO all day long. You got my word.
Thank you, sir. Always good to see you.
All right.
We're going to take a break here. And when we come back, we'll have Rutgers University law professor David Trout. And we'll also have a landlord. We'll dig deeper into this rent control law that the city council just approved last week. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Newark Today on WBGO 88.3 FM, WBGO.org. The number to call here to take part in this part of the conversation as we talk about the rent control vote by the City Council last week. The number to call is 973-297-0941. That's 973-297-0941. And in this second half hour, we have Ron Simoncini. He's the president of Axiom Communications, and he'll be speaking about property rights and so forth in Newark. And also joining us remotely is Dr. David Trout. He's from Rutgers University, the law school there. He's the director and founder of the Rutgers Center on Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity. And he's also a member of the city's Equitable Growth Advisory Commission. And he's the author of the report we've talked so much about on this station and other places as well. He authored the report, Who Owns Newark? So let's go ahead and get started. Ron, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Michael.
And you're welcome. And David, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
You're most welcome. David, let's get started with you. What is this rent control measure all about?
Well, the measure is really an effort to, I think, rein in different aspects of the affordability crisis that has affected Newark residents, Newark renters for decades now, and has expanded under the weight of several trends in the real estate market. So you have rent control, which covers about 70% of the units in the city, and that has a cap on rent increases every year. And then you have about 30% of housing that is not subject to rent control for a variety of reasons. And so I think what the mayor is trying to do, what the city council has approved, is an effort to keep rent increases for that additional 30% within a reasonable bounds, and specifically to limit any annual rent increase to no more than 5%, or be subject to a fine of some $1,250.
And David, do you know if any place in the country this has been instituted, this has been imposed, this has been used to help put a cap on the cost of housing?
It's unusual and usual, right? It's unusual that it would address non-subject units. That is, in a municipality that has adopted a rent control ordinance, there will be those units that are subject to the ordinance and those that will be exempt. Yes, you very often and throughout the state of New Jersey will see rent control where there's an effort to keep rents at a reasonable level, but you don't usually find a municipality that has passed an ordinance that attempts to go after, even having a rent control ordinance, attempts to go after additional units and make them subject to some sort of constraint, some sort of price constraint.
Ron, let me bring you into the conversation here. I want to know what your thoughts are on this rent control ordinance called the Unconscionable Rent Increase Ordinance. Your thoughts on it?
So the history in New Jersey is important to look at here, which is that in 1988, they passed what was called the Kelly Bill at the time. And I'm old enough to have been there when that happened. And it was because the rent control ordinances that had been imposed in the city since 1973 had essentially ceased construction of new apartments, especially where there was rent control, because people feared that they'd build a building, it would come under rent control, and they wouldn't be able to get their capital back out. And in this particular case, in 1993, they made an important amendment to that law. And since then, you've had an unbelievable amount of capital flow into this market and building new apartments, with the presumption of the builders that they would have 30 years to own that building outside of the regulation, and that after the 30 years, they would fall under rent control if their municipality had adopted it. And for the most part, once you have rent control in New Jersey, you keep rent control in New Jersey. There's very few communities where rent control becomes non-rent control. Every so often, there'll be a situation where a rent control community will decontrol units or will give permanent decontrol. But for the most part, a deal's a deal. So if you're an apartment owner in New Jersey and you're in a rent control community and your building's more than 30 years old, you can count on being under the rent control ordinance. I mean, my issue personally with this, not representing any multifamily owners in Newark right now, is that a deal's a deal. And if you told somebody that they could build unregulated and keep it for 30 years, you pretty much should be honoring that. And you can see in New York City why that's become a problem. In New York City, they changed the rent control ordinance very severely in the last 7 years. And New York has become an uninvestable market. Banks and lending institutions do not want to lend on multifamily purchase the way they used to. So this affects owners of all types, small owners and large owners. If you used to be able to put down 20% and borrow 80%, you now have to put down 40% and borrow 60%. And that changes the investability of a marketplace. It changes the willingness to flow capital into a marketplace. And that's never a good thing for housing, because what happens is people build less. And when people build less, pressure on prices goes up. You create a gray market. And despite the fact that your attempt was to try and make a housing more affordable for a greater number of people, you've actually limited the number of people who have access to that housing.
So do you predict then, Ron, that this is going to lead to that this is going to cool development in Newark for housing?
Yes. I mean, to expound on it more than to just say yes is actually to diminish the severity of what's happened here. What's happened here is the council has taken. First of all, I don't think this will stay. Number one, because I think it's contrary to what the state law is, and I think that someone will litigate it. And again, I don't have any clients here. And the second thing is, I absolutely want to say that, Ras Baraka is my favorite mayor in the country. So I'm not sitting here trashing a person that I admire by any means. But there's a lot of room for conversation, I think, Michael, in this property rights area. And the way to create affordability in housing is to create more housing so that there's more supply, and so that demand can be accommodated, and then people have to compete for tenants. Right now, Newark is in a situation where it's done the impossible thing. It's attracted capital to build a residential housing that's renting for $3,000 and $4,000 and $5,000 a month. You never would have thought that. So here they succeeded at what they wanted to do. They made the city more investable. They made it more attractive. And as soon as they did, what did they do? They want to stop people from doing the very thing that they wanted them to do.
But Ron, you know that there is a big battle in New Jersey, and David, feel free to chime in on this. And I'm going to mention Mount Laurel, because with Mount Laurel, there are still so many communities. When you say, okay, yeah, we need to build more housing, more affordable housing, there's so many communities that say, don't build that here. And there's that. I mean, and the fight just goes on and on and on and on, and you have to really force a lot of these communities to participate in building housing and affordable housing, and especially when it comes to multiple family units.
So I know David's going to want to talk about this too, because he's got some experience and some insights into something that I'll bring up, which is, let's look at the example of Asbury Park. Now, Asbury Park is not Newark, but in Asbury Park, they had a great deal of demand. They had developers building all through the 2000s. And they thought that they were so popular that they could increase the quotient of affordable housing required of a developer from 10% to 20%. So developers love us. They'll build 1/5 of their units instead of 1/10 of their units as affordable housing. Do you know how many units have been built in Asbury Park since they passed that law?
How many?
0. Wow. So you have to look at the economics. This is a capital-based system where housing is concerned, unless you build public housing. I would be much more in favor of taxing property to a greater degree and using the proceeds of that tax to do what they did in the 1950s and 1960s, which is build public housing that's going to be affordable and that you're going to be able to house people who can't afford the market rate. That is so much more of a direct and practical conversation. But what happens? You try to tax people and they do what? They go crazy. They don't want to be taxed higher. And so you look at the private property owner and say, you know what? He's rich. We'll just constrict his income and we'll call that affordable housing. It's never been that. And David, I think you'd agree with me on that point.
David, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's so many interesting issues Ron raises. The first thing is, I would concede that this law probably will undergo some change. It could use some exceptions. It could use some clarification. And it doesn't necessarily hit all its targets, and there will be some question with respect to how to square it with the law on exemptions for rent control that covers not just the city but the state. So I would agree with that. Some of the theoretical economic assumptions I don't necessarily share about the impact of any kind of rent regulation outside of rent control for a city like Newark. I don't believe that it is going to stymie development. And I do believe that we need something, even if it's not necessarily this. And here's one of the important distinctions between a Newark and an Asbury Park. The particular region in which Newark sits is a far more expensive, saturated region, where rents are higher everywhere else outside of Newark. And Newark is almost the next extension coming west from New York City of places for development that make sense from a developer standpoint, from a return on investment standpoint. And this has been true for some time. So I'm not sure how much Newark actually did to attract it, except to be fortunate to be a transportation hub with an airport, with a port, with an Amtrak station, and a PATH train, just 12 miles from New York City, when Jersey City had already become too expensive and everything in between had become saturated. So Newark is in some respects the beneficiary of some regional economic success, which sort of marks it for more development. It simply makes sense. It's probably overdue. On the other hand, what has also happened to Newark is that the fundamentals of the Newark population have not dramatically changed, but rents have. In other words, people who live in Newark remain a very working class population. They make on average, 80% of them are renters, and they make on average about $35,000 a year. That's actually low income, if not very low income. And it's a lot lower than the region of which it's a part, which means that they are already facing housing precarity because they don't own their homes and they're at risk of even of greater cost burden with even the slightest rent increase. So here come the investors, right, who, for reasons I just suggested, see in Newark real opportunity, and they should. And we certainly applaud it. There's nothing. I don't mean to suggest in any way that this should be discouraged, but at the same time, it has to be moderated. It has to be moderated because you don't have in Newark the kinds of renters that you have in a New York or a Boston or a San Francisco, people who are earning 6- and 7-figure salaries coming off of tech industries, because there's been that kind of fundamental economic change in the overall renter landscape. The market for renters has pretty much stayed the same in Newark, but institutional investors have come in and found opportunities to create passive streams of income for their investors in ways that are at odds with the pocketbooks of Newarkers. So Newarkers are stretched, and they're increasingly stretched. And we've been able to report on just how significant this stress is for so many families who really have no place else to go because of the regional dynamics that I just described. So given that background, what is the city supposed to do? Obviously, it can try to beef up its rent control regime. It has modified its rent control ordinance. It has tried to do more code enforcement. It has really stepped up. It's provided free legal representation for the indigent, but it has to do more than that. And some of what it has to do is to police the terms of deals that have been reached, even with new developers. Sometimes it has to push hard on compliance with inclusionary zoning, or with its inclusionary zoning ordinance, where some of these same new developers have not met the requirements that they signed on to. So it's a complicated situation where you're trying to strike a balance. You want the development on the one hand, you understand people's rights to invest, because there is money to be made in real estate. It is a business. It's bricks and mortar. Somebody's taking the risk. Somebody's got to finance it. But at the other hand, we're also talking about people's lives. They've got no place else to go, and we have to find some sort of reasonable medium.
We are talking this evening on Newark Today to David Trout from Rutgers University, who authored the report, Who Owns Newark? He is the director of the Rutgers Center on Law, Inequality, and Metropolitan Equity. And we're also talking in studio to Ron Simoncini, president of Axiom Communications, and here to talk about property and property rights and so forth in the city of Newark. If you want to participate in this conversation, we certainly hope that you do. Your thoughts, your comments, your concerns for either the professor or for Ron, the number to call here is 973-297-0941. That's 973-297-0941. and we'll continue our discussion here about rent control. Professor, I'm curious about Ron suggested one solution to this housing situation, affordability situation in Newark, is to build more public housing. Your thoughts on that? Newark just came through a period where it had these high-rise public housing units, Scudder Homes, Columbus Homes, Hayes Homes, and so forth. And a lot of those, of course, have disappeared from the landscape over the last 30, 40 years. But is building more public housing in Newark, is that a potential solution?
It's a potential solution. I agree with Ron. It's not very likely to happen. Public housing has been the domain of the federal government, since its inception. And the Faircloth Amendment barred additional public housing decades ago. It is an impediment at the federal level that prevents us from doing what I agree with Ron is the right thing to do. I think that if we've learned anything from the structure of housing subsidies in American cities over the last 40 years, is that the public-private partnership model in which we try to incentivize private developers to satisfy a public purpose is inadequate and will not produce anything close to the amount of housing that we need. And so we live with this chronic scarcity, with chronic cost burdens, with an affordability crisis that is not just affecting a swelling homelessness population, but is putting at risk so many families, even middle-class families, even recent graduates who'd like to strike out on their own, but wind up on their, back in their childhood rooms, because the affordability crisis has just prevented us from the kind of filtration and supply that we used to rely on. The only thing I would add to that, though, is that I think that there may be some creative ways where cities can utilize their resources to produce affordable housing that may not be public housing in the traditional sense, but is nevertheless has a very strong public component, particularly at the financing level. And the example that I would give in Newark that we've been doing some research on, and that the mayor has in a couple of recent initiatives also been advancing, is the notion of utilizing city-owned land. The city of Newark is one of those cities that actually has a lot more land than many other cities do. Many other cities are very scarce for land. The city has, because of its unique history, many more parcels, frankly, than it wants.
And
David, these are real assets.
David, you're talking about the vacant lots. Is that right?
Well, yeah. Well, it's we're about to come out with a report that shows thousands of units. Some are vacant lots, and they're easily buildable. Some are commercial. Some are mixed use. Some are boxed in. They're not buildable lots because they're too small, because they don't have street access, but they can be used for green space and things like that. So there are any number of housing related, economic development / commercial related, and even environmental and placemaking related uses to which these parcels can be put that really help to shape neighborhood stability, provide more in the way of affordability, and help to set the market on the city's terms based on the utilization or the maximization of what is really a public resource, and that is the land that the public itself owns.
I mentioned that the council last week voted 6-3, 6 in favor of this rent control ordinance and 3 against. And it was pretty heated. There were a lot of people there talking about this issue. There were people from Newark. There were people from different industries and so forth. And there was Mr. Kikis from Kikis, I think it is.
Nick Kikis
from New Jersey Apartment Association. And let's hear what he has to say, what he said to the city council last week.
I would like to emphasize that I think this ordinance before you does not comply with state law. There is a preemption of local rent control ordinances for new construction. Additionally, this ordinance is essentially trying to define case law, which I believe is outside of the purview of a municipal ordinance.
Ron, is this heading toward a lawsuit?
I think for sure. But I think the interesting thing, and the thing that I was smiling about earlier, was that I came on here prepared to argue, and I agree with almost everything that David said. So, and I think this conversation is driven by a lot of dynamics. One is information. I don't have exactly the same information that David has, but like he has, I've spent an awful lot of time thinking about housing and thinking about the dynamics of capital. And we would use a lot of different terms and vocabulary and approach this conversation. But the fact of the matter is rent control is necessary when the property owner has an unfair advantage in the bargain. And that's why in New Jersey, rent control is consumer protection legislation. What Nick is saying is what I was saying earlier, which is, hey, a deal's a deal and you're not holding up the deal. And I think that that's 100% accurate. But what the mayor was on here saying was, I'm trying to maintain stability in my city for people who've been here forever and who I want to keep here.
And you can understand that.
I want to protect it too. I've done 50 something property rights campaigns, most of them in rent control. And I've never once said there shouldn't be rent control where there already is rent control, because a deal's a deal. And so as I think about, this conversation and David and my different perspectives on it, there's no way that we can sustain the lifestyle in New Jersey and the communities in New Jersey without figuring out a way to keep people who have a legacy in the neighborhood. You have to figure out how to do it.
Is it going to take legislation?
Well, I think if you look at the new construction aspect of this, I'm for a marketplace that welcomes new investment and it doesn't restrain it, because I think that's when you get the most volume. However, to the point of what's the legislation that you need, if you have somebody who knowingly moved into an unregulated apartment and they got a rent increase that's consistent with the marketplace, that is a drag. But that person there's many other ways to help that person than to say to the property owner, we're canceling your deal. If when you gave him the pilot, you then agreed to the rent restriction and he voluntarily agreed to that as a condition of purchasing the land or however he came to be permitted to build it, okay, fine. So I think that there's a lot of aspects to this, and I'd have to agree with what Nick is saying relative to the specific inaction of this ordinance, but relative to the larger issue of how do we make sure that in communities like this, when the market goes crazy, the protected tenants are protected. The unprotected tenants, I think, have made their own deal. And there is a capitalist system here that has rewarded us in many ways. But I think that the vexing problem here is a supply problem. The mayor, this is a very clever mayor and a very smart mayor, and those are two different things. And he has figured out how to motivate the real estate community to do things that it heretofore has not wanted to do.
Such as?
I mean, you look at the renovations of commercial properties in Newark, look at what's happened with how they've motivated changes in their own regulatory environment, conditions issues. The management of this rent control ordinance in Newark historically has been very good, beginning with Ms. Hernandez way back in the day and all the way through. People know how to regulate housing in Newark. Is the regulation fair? Is it reasonable? I think that, there's some questions there about whether or not you could have a slightly freer market and you could let people actually enjoy the fruits of their capital. But again, those are nuanced things. The big issue is supply. And if you can figure out how to do what the mayor said when he was sitting right in the same chair that I am 20 minutes ago, which is take the property we already have and incentivize people to put something on that property that rewards our residents, then you've got something.
David, I'm curious about, the mayor also talked about perhaps legislation at the state level. Is that part of the solution here, you think?
It probably is part of it, but I do have to take issue with something that Ron is saying. Look, we free markets always sounds like a great explanation for, or a great aspiration for housing markets generally, but it can be problematic depending on where you are, which may be part of the problem with trying to get state legislation passed for problems that are unique to places like Newark or Patterson or Elizabeth or Camden. In other words, these are places where the free market can function in a far more predatory way. And I think we just have to be honest about that there are investors who will come in who will charge as much as they possibly can because they are free of constraints. And so we have to impose some sort of norm.
David, looks like your picture there, your line there froze. It looks like the connection there is not good. But Ron, I wanted to ask you this. We have a few minutes left here, and Ron, I wanted to ask you this. You said this. The fact that you came on this show and you expected to be at odds with David, and you found yourself agreeing with a lot of the things David has said. What does that say about this issue, then?
Well, I think it's relying on information, and I don't think the city council used all the information that David's using in making his analysis, or that I hope I'm making and making my assessment. And I think that they made a decision to confront a short-term problem immediately that they feel like they have to get under control right now. Certainly there's places to argue, and there were 6 of them who said yes and 3 of them who said no, and a whole bunch of people in there who weren't happy. But the longer term solution is never going to be to take away a right that somebody previously had. And that's, to make a quick explanation, property rights people are in short supply. Unhappy, overcharged tenants are in huge supply. And so it's very difficult in these environments, particularly in urban areas, for a property owner to come and make an argument that says, I think I'm being treated inequitably, and have an elected official say, well, we want to treat you equitably. What the elected official typically reacts with is, I want to protect the people in my municipality. And that does create, to the degree that David said, I take issue with what Ron's saying about free markets. I take issue with what he's saying about regulated markets. This is a balancing act.
I want to get back to Professor. We have 2 minutes here. Would you finish what you were saying?
Yeah, I was just trying to say that unregulated markets, particularly where they're vulnerable and folks have very limited bargaining power, can easily become predatory markets. And we have too long a history of that in the United States to deny it. And it has ravaged Newark, witnessed the foreclosure crisis that led to the institutional buyer frenzy that occurred just after the foreclosure crisis. So this is a city that's already been raked through the coals by a free market against which there was not sufficient bargaining power to push. And so we do have to think about what is fair, what is reasonable. Even this notion of unconscionability, which in different jurisdictions is much more easily and affirmatively presented by the tenant to say this is an unconscionable rent increase, is not possible under New Jersey law. Under New Jersey law, it's really only when a landlord raises the rent a certain amount and then tries to evict the tenant that we trigger under our anti-eviction law the question of what is an unconscionable rent. What the city of Newark is trying to do, and it still has work to go, I admit, is to try to fashion some notion of what is a reasonable rate of return for investors, but at the same time will not displace people who have every right to be here.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Rutgers University Law Professor David Trout, Ron Simoncini, President of Axiom Communications, talking about property rights in Newark. Thank you very much for taking part in this discussion tonight. Thank you for our listeners, and thank you to the crew here: Ang Santos, producer; Ken Downey Jr., call screener; Corey Goldberg, board operator; Jamaro Wakefield, social media coordinator; Doug Doyle, executive producer; and photographer from Channel 78, Gary Campbell. I'm your host, Michael Hill. This is WBGO Newark.